Morning, everybody. Hope you're having a good summer. Hannah, you want to call the roll?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Courtney League as designee for Secretary Chaudhry.
Present.
Superintendent Chaudhry.
Present.
Mr. Derenberg is absent. Ms. Eberhardt.
I'm here.
Secretary Flora.
Here.
Mr. Gibbons.
Here.
Ms. Lala is here. And Chair Casemeyer.
Here. Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate it. Alex, do we have any revisions to the agenda or public comment today?
No, Mr. Chair, no revisions and no public comment requested.
Okay. Let's move to your executive director report, Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, members of the commission. I hope you are all having an excellent summer as well. Today, I have a very brief update. My report will just quickly cover our transition process. As you know, as of July 1st, the IAC has transitioned or is in the process of transitioning to becoming an independent state agency. And that has involved a lot of work with the Department of Budget and Management and MSDE staff. And my thanks to Superintendent Chaudhry's staff, who have been very, very helpful, have extended a lot of support and courtesy through this transition process, helping us arrange for taking over certain functions that MSDE had been handling for us on the back of the house. Of course, those things, take a little bit of time, and MSDE staff support has been, really first rate. And I thank you, Superintendent, for that. We're still working through a few pieces with Department of Budget and Management, but those are scheduled to be completed over the next handful of weeks, and we should be fully transitioned in the very near future. And then second, I'll provide an update on the improvements to the space at the warehouse at Camden Yards. The tenant fit out process is proceeding right now. There have been, as all the LEAs know, challenges in the supply chain, and some of the materials required for the work have been delayed slightly, so that our move-in date of September 1st may end up being pushed back by a week, hopefully no more than 2. But it's possible that those adjustments and our sort of recovery work on that schedule will end up allowing us to move on schedule. But in any case, it'll be either on or very close to our target move date of September 1st. And again, I thank DGS staff for all of their support with that process. It has been excellent. And that's the extent of items for this current executive director's report. However, I'm very happy to stand for any questions from the members if there are any.
So you did have a meeting with the Secretary of DBM during the month. That was good.
Yes, in fact, just recently I met with Secretary Grady to go over the IAC budgets and the projections for the coming years. Had a very good discussion. IAC staff are working on data analysis that will be shared with DBM over the coming months to better inform planning on the state side for capital investments over the coming years. There are a lot of pieces that go into that, and some of the data are not yet available. We're working with MSDE staff to ensure alignment between capital approaches and operating side approaches to make sure that our IACs, our LEAs are receiving the kind of coordinated support that they need from all of the state agencies. And that's pretty much everything for now.
And Alex has also been requested to make a presentation at the Maryland Association of Counties Convention later this month.
Yes.
What are you going to talk about?
So MACO has invited a few people to come talk about pre-K as part of the blueprint, and I will be joining that panel to talk about the IAC's approach to supporting the school districts with their pre-K programming and expansions.
Good. Okay, let's move on to the consent agenda. Any comments, Alex?
No, this one is pretty short and routine. We have 24 contract awards, 1 revision, and 1 amendment to the pass-through grant allocation that had been made to Caroline County, essentially due to bids coming in higher than the budgets had been estimated for a project. So they've made a smart switch of funds to a project that they can afford to do in the near future, and they will fund the other project through local funds so that both sets of work get done. No other issues to mention there. Happy to take any questions.
Do I hear a motion that we approve the consent agenda?
So moved, Mr.
Thank
Gloria.
you.
Second.
Second, thank you. Any questions about the consent agenda? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. So as you can see, the agenda is rather short. The next item, draft recommended revisions to the gross area baselines, is something that Alex is going to brief us on today, and we will vote the next meeting. Is that correct, Alex?
Yes. Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Chair.
Go ahead.
This item we're going to take a few minutes on because it is really a complex and significant item. And that's one reason why it's coming to you for first
Alex,
reading.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's why this topic is coming to you twice this month as a first reading to give you a background and allow you to understand some details and be able to ask any questions over the next few weeks that you might have before this topic comes back to you with a final version next month for a second reading and a vote to approve. This presentation is about the proposed updated gross area baselines that staff are bringing to you for your review and questions today. And after we take into consideration any additional feedback from you, from LEAs and any other stakeholders during the next 10 days, staff will then bring a finalized proposal to you at the September IAC meeting for a second reading and vote to adopt. I will provide now some background and context, and then Melissa will walk you through the substance of the proposed updates to the GABs. Next slide, please. As you know, the IAC determines the level of state funding participation for each capital project using the 4-part project funding formula that you see in this slide. The second factor in the formula is the gross area baselines, which represent the outer boundaries of square footage that the state can support for a given enrollment. Next slide, please. Essentially, for a given enrollment, the GABs identify a total square footage that has been shown to provide enough space for delivering the state-required educational programs and services through traditional methods. They are not a prescription for a set of spaces that the state thinks an LEA should build. They are only a total outer boundary of state-supportable size within which each LEA can innovate in its delivery of programs and services and customize its designs accordingly. An LEA may build larger than the GABs if it funds the extra square footage using local dollars. There is a separate set of GABs for each of the main school types, elementary, middle, and high. Other grade configurations, such as pre-K through 8 or 6 through 12, are calculated on a case-by-case basis, but they use these 3 GAB sets as starting points. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see an example of the existing gross area baselines in both table and curve forms. As you can see, there's a decrease in the...
Alex, we can't hear you.
Thought it was just me.
Got it.
but-
Sorry about that. I have my microphone here cut off. You can see here in this slide that there are significant economies of scale that naturally occur as buildings are designed to accommodate larger number of students and staff. The IAC adopted the current GABs in 2019 with the intention of periodically updating them as the delivery of educational programs and services continually evolves. In 2019, the IAC made significant improvements to the GABs that had been in place and were untouched since the early 2000s. But at that time, we had limited data and staff capacity with which to do the kind of deep dive that we've conducted this time around. Since 2019, we've been identifying areas of potential improvement or refinement, collecting more data on built schools, and building a list of items that could benefit from adjustment in the next update. Next slide, please.
Alex, you want to take questions as they come up or wait to the end?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that. I'm happy to take questions in between slides if
Okay.
anyone has one.
Okay.
So I'll pause to look for hands.
Go ahead.
Last year, in House Bill 1290, the General Assembly mandated that the IAC update the gross area baselines to take into account 6 key topics related to the requirements in the blueprint for Maryland's future. Next slide, please. Because the topics in this mandate and those on our list for a general update overlap, staff conducted a comprehensive review of the GABs and brought all the potential adjustments together in one set of adjustments that address all the issues we found needing attention. Now, I would like Melissa to summarize the process that staff followed to conduct our analysis and the discussions with the stakeholders in the work group in preparation for developing the proposed adjustments. She will also walk you through the findings and the results along with proposed changes. All right, Melissa, I think you may be muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Next slide, please. Thank you, Alex. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. We began the process back in February at our facility planners meeting, where we initially presented our proposed approach, answered questions, and elicited feedback from LEAs who were present. We also encouraged any LEA who was interested in participating in the work group to contact us following the meeting. The work group was composed of 8 LEAs representing the full range of types of LEAs, including urban and rural, large and small, higher wealth and lower wealth, all participated. In addition, we invited 3 counties ranging from small to large and spanning the state geographically. From the state, we had staff from the AIB and from the content offices of MSDE participate. Next slide. The work group met 8 times between February and June to consider each of the 6 topics required by the statute. As expected, there was a significant amount of overlap in these topics, and LEAs were fairly consistent with the feedback they provided. We also met 6 additional times to review the data that the IAC and staff had prepared and to review the proposed revisions presented here today. And just one moment to thank participants of the work group. It's an extensive amount of time dedicated to the effort, and we appreciated all of the energy they spent doing that. Okay, next slide. So the data collection and analysis portion involved these six specific data sets that were developed and analyzed. Staff collected data in these 6 categories for each of the grade bands, including elementary school, middle school, and high school. Of these data sets, the most impactful to our eventual proposals are the items included in E and F. Item E is a detailed program analysis, included space-by-space comparisons of at least 8 recently built schools from 8 different LEAs. This was used to compare current educational practices against the data used in the development of the original GABs. Item F is the updated space tallies. The space tallies are a tool the IACs developed in order to provide guidance to develop the GABs. These are a understanding of the content of what might be in a school, but not prescriptive to what an LEA requires. We developed 2 documents. These 2 documents then developed averages, and we compared across the 2 and made updates as needed. As Alex mentioned above, the space tallies and the GABs only reflect the outer boundary of what can be provided. All programming decisions are within the purview of the LEA's choice. So next slide, please. Summary of findings from the data collection. The first is the elementary school GABs were significantly lower than the square foot required for most LEAs to properly provide the diversity of educational programming today. For example, administrative space being planned and built almost double the area that was originally provided for in the GABs. We understand from our work group findings that this is a result of the additional adults necessary to deliver and support the educational programs and services. Second item, many of the LEAs have already begun to include spaces related to needs outlined in the blueprint as a response to the needs of their student population. For example, many facilities we analyzed showed a marked increase in student support spaces and offices over previously constructed projects. Next, the middle school GABs were very closely aligned to current middle school requirements, despite that fact that some specific areas included in the analysis were significantly different than recently built work. For example, the previous GABs included a significant amount of space for bleachers in the gymnasium. Most LEAs are only including a few rows of bleachers for educational purposes, and if more are required, those are typically supported as part of the cooperative use space add-on. Next item, the high school GABs did not accurately reflect the economies of scale that can be achieved with larger buildings. Additionally, the way in which state-rated capacity and career technology education spaces were considered in the high school GABs did not match on-the-ground realities. For example, the existing square foot per student add-on for the CTE spaces did not accurately reflect the significant size difference many of the CTE spaces require. Next slide. Now, reviewing summary of the feedback from the work group, and I'm sorry that these are all numbered 1. They should be 1 through 7, but we'll work with it. So the significant findings for the work group include these items. First, the increase in number of pre-K 3 and 4 students to be served in a school requires an increase in support spaces, spaces in core program area, and space in specialty classrooms to account for their unique needs. Second, the LEA's enrollment projections will need to be adjusted in order to project demand for pre-K spaces and to support providing the appropriate level of funding in each CIP cycle. IAC staff is continuing to work collaboratively with LEAs in order to create and review this process. Next, additional space requirements for schools in high concentration of poverty or for communities with high percentage of English learners is significant and varied. This led to an add-on calculation, which we'll discuss later in the presentation. Next, in order to support special education students, more breakout space, larger classrooms, and additional office space is required for the inclusion students, in addition to the square foot add-on allotment provided for students in full day programs. Next, the greatest need for additional space is in the elementary school. This was consistent with our data analysis finding. Next, the middle schools are challenged to meet the 85% classroom utilization used in the GAB when using a team-based program delivery model and schedule. Team-based instruction, particularly in the smaller and middle schools, can make it difficult to maximize the use of classroom space without requiring students to intermingle among grade clusters or for teachers to move throughout the day. Because not all schools have this same challenge, we've not adjusted the GABs, but instead plan to address this on an as-needed case-by-case variance in a GAB variance. And finally,
one question.
Sure.
So I'm assuming that these findings are compatible with the blueprint desires in terms of what's needed in schools in the future.
Yes. We will go over specific blueprint findings and separate those out from the general requirements. Thank you. And finally, the state rated capacity for the high schools include many spaces that count as teaching stations that are designed specifically to be able to function at the 85% utilization anticipated by the GABs. PE spaces in particular were found to be problematic, and we have addressed some of those needs in our proposed changes. Next slide, please. There are 2 methods by which we are proposing to change the GABs. The first is the base square foot per student. This portion of the GAB provides for the minimum state required educational programs and services and is intended to be appropriate for all students across the state. The second means is an add-on. The add-ons, such as the current special education add-on, take into account characteristics of the specific population and add additional space as needed to support diversity and equity across the state. This type of adjustment is appropriate for space that is needed to address the specific needs of a subset of students with special characteristics or needs. Again, it's important to note that although the work group and IAC staff considered many specific space needs and added square footage in some cases to meet specific needs, the state does not demand that LEAs build those specific spaces. The purposes of the GAB is to ensure that the state is participating in funding a total area that is sufficient to meet the needs of a certain school's population. Okay, next slide. Now, just to review two of the particular categories of proposed adjustments. And here is where we're going to separate out between the blueprint requirements and general changes that result from lessons learned since the 2019 GABs. The blueprint changes do include changes both to the base square foot per student in the GABs, as well as an add-on for schools in areas of specific need. The general changes also required both additions and subtractions to the base square foot per student, and also changes to the state rated capacity calculations, as well as inclusions of additional add-ons specifically for the career and technology spaces. Next slide. So here's where we're going to address specific blueprint related changes. Since these changes did have different effects on the different GABs for the different grade bands, and we've lumped these together, and these are consistent changes across all of the grade bands. So first, the addition of pre-K 3 and 4 classrooms, and those classroom spaces were based on existing program requirements for pre-K 3 and 4 spaces. We increased the support for special education inclusion students, including increased size of classrooms, additional support spaces such as toilet rooms, pull-out rooms, and conference rooms. We increased the amount of space allotted for student support offices and conference rooms. We added square footage for behavioral specialist work area for every grade band. This space is sized to account for both an office workspace, one-on-one work, and small group work. We added English learner support spaces. We increased the square footage of breakout space to provide for student services. We increased the size of teacher collaborative space and added space for professional development in order to provide teacher training within the school during the school day. We also added flexibility to support the CTE pathways. Overall, these changes accounted for approximately 4 gross square foot per student to the GABs across all grade bands. Next slide. Now we're going to review the general changes based on each of the 3 grade bands. So for the elementary schools, we adjusted the allotment for classroom size to be a minimum of 850 square feet. Similarly, for offices, adjusted to a minimum of 100 square feet. We increased sizes of specialty classrooms to match current educational practices. We made adjustments to the storage rooms to align more closely what we saw LEAs providing. We included single-use toilet rooms, group toilet rooms for staff and students in the net program area. We added a makerspace if an LEA chooses to include one. And we took out some of the significant steps in the square foot per student to reduce the amount of bumps and make the curve a little bit smoother, just a little bit more logical. Next slide. So here you see the base GA, the 2019 GAB is the solid line. The proposed changes is the dashed line. The graph has the size of the school on the bottom and the square foot per student on the left side. Elementary schools averaged from the smallest to the largest school with an 8.6% increase.
What was the element? The elementary school minimum class size before we increased it?
There was a range of class sizes that ranged from 750 to 850.
But now it's 850.
Now it's 850 across the board. Mm-hmm.
And is that determined by the average number of students in a class?
Yes, it's both the average number of students in a class. Elementary school classrooms are counted at a 23 student per class, state rated capacity, but it's also based on the analysis we did of the spaces that LEAs are building. So it's based on the average class size being provided in new buildings today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions?
So was there a consensus or unanimity amongst the study group about the results you found, or the findings?
Yes, there was. We had a significant amount of collaboration among the group. All of the LEAs are coming at this from very different places and very different needs, but through that collaboration, I feel like we did come to a place where there was agreement. We were at an appropriate level.
Okay, thank you. Is that
Okay,
it?
next slide. Yeah, no, we got more.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, next is the middle schools. Some of these changes are sort of similar types of changes. So just going to call out the ones that are significantly different. The class size was set at a minimum of 900 square feet. And this was an across the board increase from what they previously were. We removed the excess bleachers area included for the gymnasium, intending for those, if needed, to be added as part of cooperative use space add-on. And we changed the net to gross ratio from the 70% in the previous GABs to the 67%. Now, this occurred both for the middle schools and for the high schools. It really is due to the greater number of large spaces that are provided in these programs, and those large spaces result in a larger first floor footprint and decreases the ability to get a 70% net to gross ratio. When you plan for 70%, you do end up with small congested corridors. So this is consistent with our findings in the data analysis we did, and it's consistent with industry practices.
For middle school, well, if you have an elementary middle school, how do you combine those two? Or do you just separate them out, middle school needs and elementary school, and then come up with a total based on the number of students in each?
That's a great question. It's also a policy currently under consideration. We've been working on an approach to that, and I think are getting close to a way in which we can account for the efficiency of sharing those programs and appropriately fund a project like that. So, Alex, you want to add anything?
Just that is something that has been a topic of discussion for a little bit over a year, really, and we're going to be coming forward with a recommendation and a development of a new policy on that in the next few months that will support this.
But that won't be part of this new formula that.
No, because right, it's a separate determination and a separate calculation.
So then it'll be an adjustment for this combined elementary middle or middle high school, whatever you come up with.
Yeah, what we have in place now is a calculation process in the funding determination that we need to revise based on how this ends up being finalized, and then we can put that in place to support this. It's just not included in this package.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide. This is the graph for the middle school changes. You can see it's much different than the elementary school, with slight changes for the smaller middle schools up to almost no changes for the larger middle school, and it averages a 0.75% increase. Okay, next slide. Finally, the high schools. I think the most impactful change we made to the high school was creating the GABs without assuming CTE spaces included. This changed from previous versions because they attempted to account for the extra large CTE spaces that were often being provided, and too much space was being counted into the gross GAB versus the new CTE add-on that we've developed. Second, we changed the way PE spaces were counted as teaching spaces. We removed the weight room and fitness room as teaching spaces, since these are outfitted with such significant equipment that it makes them unusable for other purposes. Second, we aligned with the real practicalities of teaching within a gymnasium and limited the number of teaching stations to be counted as 2 versus the 4 that would have applied if calculated through the previous method. And finally, we fixed the maximum size of an auditorium in lieu of continuing to increase as the school size increases, and we added some appropriate support spaces that weren't already included. So the next slide shows the graph, and you can see the most significant change to the high school is the increase in the slope. This is a result primarily of the decrease in CTE spaces included in the GAB. The range is from a negative 9% decrease in the largest of school to a 3% increase in the smallest of schools.
But to clarify, this does not include CTE spaces. They're
Right.
pulled out as an add-on.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, let's look at the add-ons. We have 2 add-ons to review.
Okay.
Next slide. Yeah. So the first add-on is based on the determination of the concentration of poverty and the percentage of English learners in a given school community. It'll be a sliding scale for both the size of the school and the percentage of the population that meets this specific requirement. And the amount will range from 1,000 square feet to 5,000 gross square feet. And the next slide. And this slide is the talks about the CTE add-on. So we're planning on having 5 categories of CTE type spaces, ranging from extra small to extra large. Each type space will have a specific gross square foot add-on. We are working to collect data, and over the coming months, IAC staff will identify the appropriate size of each of these add-ons for the 5 categories. We'll also identify each of the MSDE approved programs and into which categories we believe they fit. We'll bring this data to you at a future time for your review.
Secretary Flora has a question.
Hi. Well, first of all, looks like that's your last slide, Melissa, because I was
Yes,
kind of
it
waiting
is.
until the end. Anyways, first of all, fabulous job. I mean, the process just seems to have been extremely thorough, and really, really great work here. As I had questions along the way, you ended up answering them in the presentation, things like makerspace and a few things like that. One of the questions I do have is about the concentration of poverty calculus in terms of, how is that disaggregated beyond the county level? In terms of, a lot of times the data can be misleading in terms of where those concentrations of poverty are because of private schools, or maybe particularly right now, we have wealthy individuals coming in and buying homes, and there's an appearance of a wealthier county in some case, but yet we still have a very high concentrations of poverty in those areas. And so I'm curious about whether that was disaggregated beyond just the broad county level. And if you can tell me a little bit more about that calculus.
I'll give you a little introduction and probably hand off to Alex. So the data that we have comes from MSDE, and it's on a school by school basis. And Alex, you want to talk any more about?
No, that's exactly right. We've been working with MSDE's data group on getting the most recent concentration of poverty statistics for each school community, so that what we're providing in a project allocation matches the students that will be going into that school. So that's exactly the intention, I think, is of what you had raised. I would certainly, be happy if Superintendent Chaudhry had anything to add there. Welcome to.
It's not a county level analysis. It's a school level, student level analysis. using direct certification and the forms, FRLP, the free reduced lunch measure. Are there better measures? Absolutely. I published a report last year and had Delegate Smith introduce tiers of poverty using census data and going depth, but that's I'm hoping to move that mountain maybe next session. But for now, it is still at the school level. It is direct certification as well as districts that have a reliance on forms and such. And then if they're a CEP district, community eligibility district, because they have so many kids already at that threshold, it's counted as 100%, right? But it's not at the county level in terms of that rating and square footage. In terms of what they're calculating here, it's defined in law already in that way too.
Great. Thank you, Secretary. That's reassuring. Because I what I'm also seeing beyond that, and this is probably beyond this conversation, so I won't belabor it, but we end up with these concentrations, and then the calculus becomes such that there's I guess, from an economic development standpoint, it's hard to look at the projections because people won't move into those areas. And so you have this spiral effect that if we can't sort of kind of get past that and even add more to those areas where we can, help the overall economy, because then you have people who are literally living across the line because of a school district, and it just continues to create a spiraling condition for the other area. And I'm sort of trying to figure out, and I don't know if this particular approach is going to help us kind of boost out of some of those situations, which maybe it's a different conversation, but that's why I zeroed in on that particular question.
There's another policy being developed to make sure there's no perverse incentives to further segregate like we do in this country. So it would be nice if everyone had the vision of Columbia and we built the country that way. My achievement gap wouldn't be 14 points, it would be 10 points. But unfortunately, we suck at housing in this country, and we continue to do this, blue and red cities. So we have work to do there. So if you want to talk about desegregation, that's a different conversation. Happy to talk about that. I'm not shy. But on this issue,
yes,
we have talked about with IAC, and my team is working on a policy to make sure that they're not purposely drawing out attendance zones to essentially get that extra bump to just pile on disadvantage on disadvantage. So existing schools that are already there, boundaries that already sit like that, yes, that will get that bump. But if they're drawing new lines just to get an edge, there's going to be a check. And we've talked about that with the AIB and the AIC. And so there's something in the works related to that. Blocks away from 200 West Baltimore Street, where my headquarters is, go one way, $1 million condos go another way, abandoned neighborhoods. So that's a different conversation.
It is. And I look forward to maybe having that conversation with you, Secretary, in terms of how planning can be part of that. So thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Also, in that conversation of poverty, it changes. I mean, it can radically change within 5-year period in urban areas as in other areas. So is this proposed that the concentration of poverty is at the time that they come and ask for the money, or is it a range over what it's been over the past 5 years, or a projection of where it's headed? The same way with English language learners. A school might have, 1%, and within 5 years, it's gone up to 20%. So how do we deal with trying to figure that out when it can be so flexible?
Right. Mr. Chair, if I may respond to Ms. Eberhardt's question. Yes, we're looking very closely at that exact issue because it's impossible to predict with accuracy the characteristics or makeup of a student enrollment in the future, because we don't know what is going to change with families and students and the dynamics in communities. What the best we have to go on is the current makeup, right, as sort of snapshot in time at this point. So for these factors, we do have to use current numbers. we cannot really accurately project. What we can project reasonably is the number of students, and that's the regular enrollment process that we facilitate with the LEAs and the Maryland Department of Planning each year. For these, though, what we're doing is we're keeping this flexible so that, to Superintendent Chaudhry's point, we are going to be able to use whatever the best, most current data sources are for measuring poverty and needs of a community as well as English learners. And as MSDE shifts, perhaps over time, its data elements and metrics on this, the IAC can shift along with and continue to modernize this so that this add-on, we're essentially proposing an add-on, but the data on which the add-on is based can evolve over time as those data get better. So we're taking what we think here is the most flexible approach that doesn't hinder development of better data and allocations, but rather is ready to evolve with it.
Is that okay, Ms. Everhart?
Maybe. Concentration of poverty. We take enrollment, not just at what is there right now, but we're looking at, is a new development being built? So we can take in other factors for the future. It seems like poverty, we can look at, are they building a sky rise, building for millions of dollars versus market rate housing for that neighborhood. So it seems like in planning, or we would be able to at least look at the future of that area to see what might impact the poverty or English language learners. So if there's been an increase of English language learners over a decade, and that continues to be increasing, it just seems like there should be some way, because we're projecting enrollment over time in the future, that we might be able to do poverty in English language learners. But I don't know. I just throw that out as a factor that we can come back and talk about in the future.
Point well taken, and we will absolutely look hard at that with MSDE over the next few months as we finalize the data that are used to calculate this add-on. Certainly, we want to be able to ensure that the students in the future will have what they need to learn, and that the staff will have what they need to support those students. The challenge is it's just not always visible to us at this point in time. And so we have to come up with a system that doesn't misallocate, but that is open to case-by-case adjustment, which is why we have a variance process where any LEA can come to us and say, we have special information about this specific school that suggests that, or here's actually another thing that's more likely. The LEA might say, we're planning to redistrict, right, to adjust our attendance zones in 3 years for that set of schools. And we know it's going to have effects on the demographic makeup of the schools. So in preparation for that, they can provide that to the IAC staff, and we can say, we see that in this specific case, you're going to need more space for these certain programs and services there. And if that is likely or certain enough that it won't be funded and then not used, we could make provisions on a case-by-case basis for that. So we're absolutely paying attention to those issues, but there isn't a simple mathematical solution that we can put in place here that will cover all those potential cases.
Yeah, I do like that flexibility. Thank you.
And the LEAs are, if there is a project at that school, like an addition because of growth or because of changes in needs, and the LEA comes back to a project, they are eligible to change their GAB based on the population change, and so could get state funding for those additions if so needed. Small caveat, but if needed.
Yeah.
Secretary Flora.
Yes, thank you. I have a few other questions, but just to kind of try to wrap up on this one. The combination of concentration of poverty and English learner as sort of first of all, I like the add-ons. I think that's great in terms of just giving us that flexibility, and, Department of Planning continue to work in every way we possibly can, since we host the state data center and all the census data. So we run all kinds of numbers on this. So we're happy to work with education and IAC and everyone involved with, trying to even look at scenarios as best as we possibly can. But in terms of combining concentration of poverty and English learner add-ons, well, I realize the trend might be that those things sort of go hand in hand. I'm just wondering if any thought was given to breaking those things apart. And then, as related to that, because one of the governor's priorities is to end childhood poverty, we know a big part of that will be education. So I just really want to make sure we have even enough emphasis, and whether or not these two areas should be separated versus combined into one category. So I'll just throw that out there for comment.
Sure. Thank you, Secretary Flora. So just the first answer on that is we are looking at how and whether these should be served, whether together or apart. The first thing that we have to keep in mind, though, is that this is not the primary agency that is guiding these is really MSDE, and so the IAC can't take an approach that doesn't match with MSDE's approach for supporting school programs. At this time, and Melissa will be able to add a little bit more on this that should help illuminate. We've seen that the overlap is so significant that we think it makes sense to combine these right now, or at least on the data that's available. But this is not to say that 3-5 years from now, we don't say, oh, now we can see how these ought to be broken apart and properly funded separately. And we can certainly bring that to you at that time. Melissa, do you have any other comments to add on that?
Yeah, I will say that we have produced some worksheets that are able to calculate this, and we are working with a couple LEAs to test the functionality. The first LEA has confirmed that this does work for their particular set of needs. We're hoping to get additional feedback from that exercise. So, like Alex said, we have talked long and hard about multiple different ways to do this. And to some extent, we are a little bit governed by what the information is available to us right now. So we'll continue to get the feedback from the LEAs as this is tested. And if there's anything that comes out of that, we'll bring it to you in September before we're voting on this.
Right. Thanks, Melissa. And please know I totally support all of this. I think the work is tremendous. It's just kind of trying to understand some of the specifics a little bit more.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And I think this is the most challenging part of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also, Mr. Superintendent, if there's anything else you'd like to interject on this, happy to have your comments.
No, there's definitely better ways. It's what we have at hand, what you can accurately get, and that's stable, versus as soon as you include 20 different data sources, right, to be able to know the building and the high rise and the projection, that's where it, gets, I'm a huge fan of indices, but at a certain point you begin to water down the predictive value. And so I think right now, this is what we have at hand. Some of what we can do here at the department is defined in the blueprint legislation, calculate in this way. And so, but I think there's definitely better ways to do this, and we should. I think the variance process leaves that open. I think what will be good for future meetings is once we set this, like showing us examples, like, hey, this school's demographic is this, and here's what it generates, so we can like kind of get a feel of what it looks like. So I'd love to see that as well if the other members are open and the chair is open to that. So,
right.
Just one last point. I'd like to see the split between concentration of poverty and English language learners. But should we separate it in two, or is there a true overlap between these two? And what difference of funding would that make if it's separated or different. I'm just thinking of Baltimore City. We have so few English language learners compared to concentration of poverty. Montgomery County has a huge number of English language learners, I believe. I mean, so how do we look at each of those? And is it a combination or is it two separate add-ons?
Over 95% of English learners are economically disadvantaged right now in the state of Maryland. So the overlap is like very tight. Just so you know, very rare few English learners are coming into our state or in the country who are non-economic disadvantaged. There are, but it is very, very rare right now. So the overlap is very, very strong. Another fact: 75% of our English learners are U.S. born, and so they are students living in children in poverty and everything else. So the overlap is strong. I think the separated activity, like you would like to see, you won't see much of a difference right now, at least. Yeah.
Okay, great point. I'll not worry about the combination then. Thank you.
Thank you. Melissa, you're going to continue, or Alex?
That's
This is the
actually the
slide, yeah.
final slide of the deck. So
Oh, okay.
in conclusion, Secretary Flora, you have a hand up?
Keep going. I just had two other topics that I had questions on, but please continue on this. I'll just wait for those.
So the final note to make here is that this is our first reading. We are going to take feedback again through the 21st from LEAs and stakeholders, as well as any questions that you might have. You certainly can just simply pick up the phone, reach out, call me. Happy to chat, provide additional detail if you desire. And then we will make any needed adjustments in light of all that feedback and bring the final draft to you in the September meeting. Of course, you'll get that package in your agenda the week beforehand for your review. And happy to stand for any other questions, such as yours, Madam Secretary.
Any other questions on this particular issue? Secretary Flora.
Yeah, it's the topic of resiliency. I'm curious in your calculations in terms of schools serving as essentially safe havens during, whether it been how we had to adjust for COVID, that type of, kind of sudden shock event type situation, or of course, natural disasters. But I'm sort of in the middle of all of that, the multiple hats that I wear. And so as we look at this and we look at some of the adjustments and whatnot, I mean, schools are obvious in a place of potential safe haven. They're also a place where, I think as we learned through COVID, those other types of disasters or shocks to communities and whatnot. And I'm just curious, once again, in your methods and how you've looked at this and how you look at projections and how we think of schools in the future, to what extent that's being factored in as becoming essentially a community resource during those types of situations.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think that the GABs, certainly have not been a vehicle for addressing that issue in the past, and might not be the right way or the place to do it. However, certain schools are identified in concert by the local authorities and the state agencies responsible, including the emergency management agency, as to whether they serve as emergency shelter or not. And we do get that information up front in the process, and can adjust to specific issues and needs around that. I don't know that there's ever been a discussion of whether there should be factors in the GABs for that. However, we can certainly explore and have further discussion on that. Happy to put that kind of on the table for, study.
Yeah, my thought, Alex, is that, there may be what we call, for lack of a better word, how we have food deserts. Perhaps we have areas that are literally, void of those types of spaces, which might be best served by the school in that area, whereas other counties or areas may have plenty of those types of shelters. And so while it indirectly relates, but in some respects it might directly relate as potentially an add-on in terms of sort of how do we kind of look at that role of schools, particularly in some areas where there may be very little other options available. So I throw that out as something to maybe give consideration to. Obviously, this process has been very thorough, but I want to just kind of add that to your thinking as you all move forward.
Absolutely. We'll take a look at that. Thank you. And I look forward to getting back to you for further conversation on that point.
Any other questions about the GAB? A lot of work. Congratulations, Melissa and Alex, for putting this all together.
Well, we thank all the LEAs and county folks who've participated because that was essential and much appreciated.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Everhart, you're on mute.
I would also say this is amazing work that's been done over this past year, and appreciate all the work and cooperation of all the different agencies that it took to make this happen. Thank you, everyone.
Secretary Floyd, do you have a question?
No, I think by hands down, I'm good.
Okay.
Tremendous amount of work. Really appreciate the detailed presentation today, and appreciate the fact that we can hold off a vote until next time as these things get considered. But wonderful work. Thank you all.
Thank you. Alex, anything else you want to bring up?
That's everything. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anyone else have any questions in general about anything else? Do you hear a motion that we adjourn?
Motion.
Second, Ms. Everhart. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay.